In the twilight of the world, where shadows stretch longer than the day, there dwells a God who is both silence and terror. He is the chill that clings to bones, the whisper of decay upon the wind, the unblinking gaze of the skull that watches from eternity. His name is Ah Puch, Lord of Death, ruler of the underworld, master of dissolution. Where Chak brings thunder and rain, where Yum Cox offers the gift of maize, Ah Puch claims what is left when all gifts are spent. He is not harvest but the hollow husk after harvest, not storm but the silence that follows. His kingdom lies beneath roots and stone, in caverns deep and endless, where rivers of darkness carry the souls of men. He is the judge, the devourer, the inevitable end. Yet in his presence is also truth, that life has meaning only because of death, that the body is sacred because it must wither, that memory is precious because it fades. To speak of Ah Puch is to speak of the destiny shared by all flesh, the eternal shadow that follows every breath. When the drums fall silent, when the owl cries in the night, the Lord of Xibalbá awakens, and none may escape his gaze. Before the maize was planted, before the rains descended, before the sun carved its path across the heavens, there was only darkness. Not the darkness of night, which promises dawn, but a deeper void, heavy and absolute, a silence older than time. From this womb of shadows, death emerged, not as an ending but as a beginning. Ah Puch rose from the breath of decay itself. Where the first creatures perished, where the first bones cracked beneath the weight of earth, where the first flesh softened into soil, he took form. His face was the mask of death, a skull crowned with flesh that withered yet never rotted away. His body was draped in the tokens of corruption, necklaces of human eyes, bells that jingled with each step to announce the arrival of the inevitable, ornaments made from bones that whispered as they clattered together. He was not born from love nor from creation's joy. He was born from necessity. For in a world where life rose from maize and water, there needed also to be dissolution, a return to silence, a keeper of endings. Without him, the world would choke upon its own abundance. Without him, the cycle would not turn. Ah Puch was not a curse but a balance, though men came to fear him. For though they loved the sun, they could not live without the night, and though they longed for life, they could not deny death. As the gods of rain, maize, and sun shaped the living world, Ah Puch claimed his dominion in the caverns below. He carved his throne from skulls and seated himself upon a mountain of bones. Around him rivers of black water flowed, carrying the souls of the dead into endless depths. Bats clung to the ceilings of his halls, owls perched upon his shoulders, and serpents coiled at his feet. His kingdom was Xibalbá, the underworld, a realm not of torment alone but of trials, silence, and transformation. It was said that the path into Xibalbá was filled with endless tests. Crossroads of false choices, houses of darkness, houses of cold, houses of knives, each a mirror of the fears that dwelled in human hearts. To pass through was to face one's essence stripped bare, for nothing hidden could survive the gaze of death. Ah Puch ruled not alone but as the first and greatest of the lords of Xibalbá. Around him gathered others, lords of disease, lords of suffering, lords of decay, each a fragment of the endless tapestry of death. But it was Ah Puch who reigned above them all, for he was not merely one aspect of death but its embodiment. The sound of his bells became the omen of passing. Wherever their faint chime was heard, life faltered. Wherever owls circled in the night, men whispered his name and hid their faces. For though his kingdom lay below, his reach extended into every breath upon the earth. Though feared, Ah Puch was not only destruction. His gift was mortality, and with it came meaning. Without him, the maze would grow without end, choking itself until all fields turned barren. Without him, the people would live without urgency, without reverence, without the sweetness that comes from knowing the fragility of breath. The Maya understood this truth deeply. To them, Ah Puch was a reminder that each day must be honored, each ritual performed with care, each meal taken with gratitude. For at any moment, his bells might sound and a life would be claimed. In this way, death sanctified life just as endings sanctify beginnings. Temples rose not only to the gods of harvest and storm, but also to the god of death. Offerings were given to him so that he might receive souls gently, guiding them into the halls of Xibalbá. Masks painted as skulls were worn in his honor, dances performed to remind the living that they too bore death within them. The rituals of funerals were not merely farewells but affirmations of the covenant with Ah Puch, that he was part of the cycle, not its enemy. Thus in his grim visage lay also wisdom. For though men trembled at the sight of bones, they knew that within them was hidden truth, that death was not to be denied but embraced as the other face of life. The first man who fell beneath the sun was not forgotten, for his death was the seed from which Ah Puch drew his power. When his breath ceased and his body cooled, the gods of life looked upon one another in silence, unsure of what was to be done. His flesh softened, his eyes dimmed, his bones pressed into the soil, and from this transformation, Ah Puch rose in full dominion. The first corpse became his temple. Worms that moved through its veins became his priests. The stench of decay became his incense. Flies circled above it like votive fires, carrying the essence of corruption into the air. The body, once vibrant, was now a hymn to Ah Puch, the first offering, the first ritual, the first reminder that all who are born must one day return. Thus, death was not seen as accident but as inevitability. From the first corpse to the countless generations that followed, Ah Puch claimed what was his, not in cruelty but in truth. His bells rang in every passing, not as condemnation but as announcement. The cycle continues, the covenant is fulfilled. Ah Puch bore many forms, but his most dreaded was the visage of the skull. Painted in bone white, streaked with the black of rot, crowned with eyes that gleamed like embers in ash, his mask reflected the destiny of all men. His jaw was often broken, gaping in a grin both mocking and eternal, as if laughing at the futility of denying him. The people of Maze painted their faces with skulls during festivals of death, not to mock, but to remember. For in adorning themselves with death, they acknowledged its presence within them. Children danced with faces painted like bones, warriors carved skulls upon their shields, priests wore masks with hollow sockets, all as reminders that Ah Puch dwelled in every heartbeat. The mask was both terror and wisdom. It stripped away illusion, revealing the truth that beneath skin and flesh, all were equal. Kings and peasants, warriors and farmers, women grinding maize and priests offering incense, all bore the same mask beneath their faces, and all would one day wear it openly in the halls of Xibalbá. In this way the skull was not only the symbol of Ah Puch but the most honest image of humanity. Though Ah Puch reigned supreme in Xibalbá, he was not alone. Around his throne of bones gathered the lesser lords of death, each embodying a fragment of his dominion. One brought disease, spreading fever like a shadow that drained the body from within. Another spread suffering, twisting the flesh with pain until mercy came in the form of silence. Others carried famine, accident, or the sudden collapse of breath. Together they formed a court not of splendor but of inevitability. Their feasts were bones, their songs the wails of the dying, their dances the staggering steps of the sick. Yet beneath this dread lay purpose. Each lord played his part in the cycle, each carried souls from the world above into the depths of Xibalbá, each ensured that life remained fragile and thus precious. Ah Puch sat above them, the crown of dissolution upon his brow, watching with eyes that saw through skin into the marrow of truth. His was not the cruelty of whim, but the certainty of law. As the sun must set, as rain must fall, as maize must wither to seed, so too must every life descend into his halls. The path into Xibalbá was long and terrible. It began in caves whose mouths yawned like skulls, drawing travelers into the breath of the underworld. Within, darkness swallowed sight, and rivers of black water flowed in silence. Those who descended felt the weight of the world above pressing upon them, as though every step pulled them deeper into the marrow of the earth. The journey passed through the houses of trial. In the house of darkness, no flame endured. Shadows pressed upon the soul until the heart faltered. In the house of cold, frost clung to the skin, gnawing at flesh until teeth chattered like bones upon stone. In the house of knives, the air itself was sharp, cutting with every breath. And beyond lay countless others, each a mirror of fear, each stripping away the strength of mortals until only truth remained. At the end of this passage stood the throne of Ah Puch. Upon it, the Lord of Death waited, silent but absolute, his bells announcing the arrival of yet another soul. No plea could move him, no bribe sway him, no ritual reverse his decree. In his halls all were equal, all were silent, all were claimed. Though feared, Ah Puch was necessary. Without him life would overflow, collapsing beneath its own abundance. Without death there would be no hunger, no reverence, no urgency to honor the gods. The Maya understood that Ah Puch's rule was not cruelty but balance. His silence gave meaning to song, his darkness gave meaning to light, his corruption gave meaning to the sweetness of life. In this truth lay wisdom deeper than fear. For the people knew that to live without acknowledging Ah Puch was to live in illusion. Every festival of maize, every prayer for rain, every celebration of fertility was shadowed by his presence, reminding them that all gifts end and endings are sacred. Thus, Ah Puch was not only the god of terror but the god of wisdom, the one who revealed that all things are fleeting and therefore precious. In the nights of the Maya world, when the stars gleamed like shards of jade across the black sky, a single sound could silence even the bravest heart, the cry of the owl. To the people of maize, the owl was not merely a bird of the night, but the herald of Ah Puch. Its eyes glowed with the reflection of firelight, yet they were said to see not the living but the dead. Its wings moved without sound, a shadow sliding across the moonlit ground, and wherever it circled, death soon followed. The owl bore death upon its feathers, carrying messages from Xibalbá into the waking world. Its call was the whisper of the underworld, a summons none could deny. Farmers, hunters, and kings alike trembled at its cry, for it was the chime of Ah Puch's bells echoing through the forest. When owls gathered upon rooftops or trees, the people prepared offerings, knowing that the storm of silence approached. In this way the owl was not only a creature of dread but also of reminder. It forced men to live with awareness of their fragility. It taught them that each breath was borrowed, each step walked under the shadow of wings unseen. The owl was the first sign, the breath before the storm, the gaze of Ah Puch watching from the darkness. To the Maya, the body itself was sacred because it belonged ultimately to Ah Puch. At birth, flesh was entrusted to life, but at death, it was returned to the Lord of Bones. Funerary rituals reflected this truth. Corpses were adorned with jade, corn, and offerings of food, gifts meant not to preserve the dead but to guide them into Xibalbá. The body was wrapped and lowered into the earth, where worms and soil continued the sacred work of transformation, breaking flesh into the language of Ah Puch. Some bodies were cast into cenotes, their descent into water echoing the return of all life into the womb of the underworld. Others were placed in tombs, surrounded by masks and ornaments that spoke of the skull, the eternal symbol of the god. In each case, the ritual was not an attempt to deny death, but to embrace it, to acknowledge that Ah Puch was present in every decay and that decay itself was holy. Even the skulls of ancestors were kept in shrines, their hollow eyes watching over the living, their presence a constant reminder that Ah Puch lingered close. To eat, to breathe, to celebrate was always to do so beneath the gaze of bone. The sacred book of the Maya, the Popol Vuh, spoke of the underworld with dread and reverence. It told of Xibalbá as a place of trials where even heroes were tested by the lords of death. Though many bore titles of terror, those who brought disease, those who spread suffering, those who mocked the living, it was Ah Puch who embodied them all, the silent sovereign above their court. In the tales, mortals who entered Xibalbá faced houses of ordeal, rivers of blood, challenges that revealed the fragility of flesh. These were not simply punishments but lessons, reminders that human pride could not endure beyond the gaze of death. Even the greatest heroes, the twins who defied the lords, could not escape death entirely. Their story itself was a hymn to the balance, for even victory in Xibalbá carried the weight of mortality. Ah Puch, though rarely named directly, was present in every shadow, every laugh of the lords, every trial that ended in silence. For he was the principle behind all endings, the breath that extinguished every flame. The Popol Vuh was not merely a tale of heroism but an echo of the eternal truth. No life, no triumph, no harvest could endure without death to complete it. Festivals of death were held not only in fear but also in reverence. During such times, dancers painted their bodies as skeletons, moving through plazas to the rhythm of drums that imitated the heartbeat of Xibalbá. Their movements were jerking, staggering, meant to mirror the steps of corpses rising and falling. Skulls carved of wood or stone were displayed, masks of bone were worn, and offerings of maize and drink were poured upon the ground for the god of death. The people did not celebrate Ah Puch as they celebrated Chak or Yum Cox. They did not ask for abundance or fertility. They honored him through remembrance, acknowledging that his presence was the thread that wove their days into cycles. The dance of bones was a living reminder that the flesh they moved within was temporary, that beneath the skin each man already bore the mask of the skull. Children laughed at the dancers, but behind their laughter trembled awe, for they knew that one day they too would dance not in play but in silence, joining the eternal festival of Xibalbá. Night belonged to Ah Puch. When the sun descended and the last glow of twilight faded, his dominion spread across the land. Darkness was his cloak, silence his voice, the stars his ornaments scattered upon a sky as black as his kingdom. The Maya feared the night not only for its predators and shadows but because it was the closest mirror of death. Each evening was a rehearsal for the silence of the tomb, each dawn a rebirth. Sleep itself was a lesser form of death, a surrender into the hands of Ah Puch, and dreams were believed to be journeys into Xibalbá, guided by his unseen hand. The night owl's cry, the sudden rustle in the jungle, the whisper of wind through trees, all were signs that the Lord of Death walked among men. His bells did not always sound with fury, often they were subtle, barely heard, reminding all that his gaze never lifted. Thus, every night was sacred, every dream a passage, every silence a lesson. The night was his veil, and through it he reminded mortals of their fragility and their place within the eternal balance. Ah Puch did not manifest only in the silence of tombs or the cries of owls. His presence was also felt in the invisible touch of sickness. Fevers that spread like fire through the body, coughs that shook the chest until breath was lost, the pallor of flesh fading into the hue of bone, all were his subtle marks. Disease was one of his messengers, a reminder that life could end not only in battle or old age, but at any moment, unseen and unstoppable. The Maya saw plagues as the breath of Xibalbá rising into the world above. They burned incense to purify the air, painted symbols of bones upon their skin to ward off the touch of the Lord of Death, and offered maize and water at shrines to appease him. Yet no ritual could prevent entirely what was destined. For sickness was not only punishment but balance, thinning the numbers of the living, reminding all that abundance without death leads to ruin. Ah Puch did not strike with cruelty. He struck with certainty. His sicknesses humbled kings and peasants alike, leveling all beneath the same fate. The cough of a child, the shiver of an elder, the sudden silence of a warrior, each was an echo of his presence, each a bell of Xibalbá ringing softly in the air. To the Maya, the human body was a temple, a house where the divine spark resided during life. Yet this temple was not eternal. When breath left it, the body became an offering, slowly surrendered to Ah Puch. Flesh softened, bones loosened, hair fell like leaves in autumn. Each stage of decay was not corruption but ritual, a sacred dismantling of the temple so that its essence could return to the cycle. Worms and insects were not seen as enemies, but as priests of dissolution, carrying out the work of transformation. The scent of rot was not mere horror, but incense of the underworld, a reminder that the earth reclaims all. Even the skull, once hidden beneath flesh, emerged as the final altar, a relic that bore witness to the life that had been. In this way, death was not annihilation but continuation. The temple of flesh was never wasted, it was disassembled piece by piece, each fragment returning to soil, to water, to air. Ah Puch received the body not as ruin but as sacrifice. The cult of death demanded offerings, for just as Chak was appeased with gifts to bring rain, so too was Ah Puch honored with blood and bone. Sacrifice was not always destruction but exchange. In moments of plague, famine, or war, victims were given to the Lord of Death, their bodies painted, their skulls adorned, their passage into Xibalbá hastened. Cenotes received bodies that sank into darkness, their souls entering the womb of the underworld. Altars received skulls that were displayed as trophies, not to glorify violence, but to remind all that death dwelled close. The spilling of blood upon stone was both prayer and surrender, acknowledging that Ah Puch was owed his share of every life. These sacrifices were not only for the dead but for the living. To honor Ah Puch was to ensure his hand would not fall too heavily upon the community. To neglect him was to invite famine, plague, and sudden death. Thus, men gave willingly, for in giving they balanced the scales and reaffirmed their place in the cycle. The Maya did not see death as an end, but as a movement in the great cycle. Just as the sun descended each evening into the underworld only to rise again, so too did the soul descend into Xibalbá, where trials awaited, and from which it might rise into transformation. The moon waned and waxed, maize withered and sprouted anew, rivers dried and returned with rains, All these mirrored the eternal rhythm of death and rebirth. Ah Puch was the guardian of this passage. He did not imprison the soul, but tested it, stripped it of illusion, forced it to confront its truth. Only then could it return, purified, to continue its journey. In this way, his terror was also mercy, for he ensured that nothing false endured, only essence. Thus, every sunset was a hymn to Ah Puch, every waning moon his sign, every withered stalk of maize his teaching. The people lived surrounded by his symbols, never far from the reminder that all life flows into silence before it rises again. The greatest weapon of Ah Puch was not plague, nor owl, nor bone, but silence. In his halls no laughter endured, no cry remained, no song escaped. The silence of Xibalbá was absolute, pressing upon the soul like weight upon the chest. It was in this silence that mortals faced themselves, stripped of all masks. The Maya feared silence, yet revered it. In moments of ritual, when drums ceased and voices stilled, the silence itself was presence, the descent of Ah Puch among them. For silence reminded them of the tomb, of the end of breath, of the stillness that awaited all. Even in the living world, silence carried his mark. The sudden hush of the jungle at night, the absence of wind, the stillness before a storm, all were his shadows stretching upward from Xibalbá. To live with silence was to live with death close at hand. Beneath the skin of the earth, hidden from the eyes of the living, flowed the rivers of Xibalbá. They were not streams of clear water, but dark currents heavy with silence, moving without sound, carrying the souls of the departed into the depths of eternity. Some were said to be rivers of blood, reflecting the red hue of sacrifice. Others ran cold as obsidian, freezing all who touched them. Still others shimmered with a strange phosphorescence, guiding souls deeper into the labyrinth of the dead. These rivers were the veins of Ah Puch's kingdom, pulsing through caverns and chambers like lifeblood reversed. Just as human veins carried life through the body, the rivers of Xibalbá carried death through the earth. To fall into them was to surrender to his embrace, to be borne away from the light of the sun and delivered into silence. The Maya believed that cenotes on the surface were mouths of these rivers. To gaze into their depths was to glimpse the veins of the underworld, to stand at the threshold where the living could offer gifts and the dead could pass. When a body sank into a cenote, it was not lost, but carried into the currents of Ah Puch's realm. The splash was the beginning of a journey, the final descent into the rivers of silence. Bones were more than remains. They were memory. When flesh decayed, when blood vanished into the soil, bones endured, silent witnesses to the passage of life. The Maya saw them not only as relics of the dead, but as sacred vessels, still connected to Ah Puch, still carrying the echo of the covenant of mortality. Skulls were carved into altars, jawbones hung as ornaments, femurs shaped into flutes whose hollow sound mimicked the whisper of the underworld. These were not acts of desecration but of reverence, for in using bones, the living acknowledged that they too were bound to death. The music of bone flutes was eerie, trembling, carrying across plazas like the breath of Xibalbá itself. In every note, Ah Puch listened and the people remembered. Bones arranged in patterns became cosmic symbols, mirrors of the stars, reminders that death was not chaos but order. Just as constellations traced the heavens, bones traced the truth of mortality, unbroken lines leading into eternity. Maize, the flesh of the people, grew and withered in cycles that mirrored death itself. Each seed buried in the ground was a corpse, laid to rest in the soil, covered by earth as by a tomb. In silence it decayed, splitting open, its husk dissolving, and from this decay new life rose. The people understood that this was Ah Puch's work. He ruled over the seed's death, but he allowed the sprout's birth. Without him the kernel would never break and no stalk would rise. Thus even the food of life was bound to him. Each tortilla was made not only from maize but from death transformed. Each sip of atol carried the flavor of endings that had been transfigured into beginnings. The covenant of maize and rain, though bright and fertile, could not exist without the shadow of death. For every harvest was also a funeral. The golden fields were graves, and each stalk cut was a body surrendered. In this way, Ah Puch was present in every meal, in every feast, in every act of sustenance. Life was possible only because of death, and the people of maize lived always in the shadow of his presence. Though Ah Puch ruled beneath the earth, his power was written also in the sky. The stars, bright yet destined to fade with the coming dawn, were symbols of mortality. Their rising and setting mirrored the birth and death of all things. The Maya looked upward and saw not only the promise of gods of fertility and light, but also the certainty of the Lord of Death. Eclipses were his cloak, moments when the sun or moon vanished into shadow. To witness them was to see the veil of Xibalbá drawn across the heavens, reminding mortals that even celestial fire could be consumed. Comets and meteors were his sparks, bones of the sky burning as they fell, omens of endings. The thunderless silence of certain nights, when even animals held their breath, was his presence stretched across the stars. Thus both beneath and above, Ah Puch reigned. His dominion was total, for death was not confined to caverns or bones. It was inscribed in the stars, carried in the wind, etched into every cycle of light and shadow. At last, the Maya understood that Ah Puch was not an intruder in their world but its foundation. Without him there could be no rhythm, no cycle, no meaning. Life without death was stagnation, and abundance without decay was ruin. By accepting him, they accepted the balance that sustained all existence. Thus the people lived with both fear and reverence. They whispered prayers when owls cried, they cast offerings into cenotes, they painted skulls upon their faces, they honored bones as sacred relics. They did not resist death, for resistance was folly. They embraced it as covenant, as shadow, as inevitable return. And Ah Puch, seated upon his throne of bones, ruled in silence. His bells rang softly in every death, his owls cried in every night, his gaze lingered in every skull. He was not distant. He was present in all things, in every breath taken and every breath lost. He was the eternal law, the truth from which no man could turn. Thus was the birth of death, not an accident, not a curse, but the emergence of balance eternal. From the first corpse to the endless cycle of maize, from the rivers of Xibalbá to the stars that burn and fade, Ah Puch was there, watching, waiting, reminding. The Maya did not name him lightly. To speak of him was to acknowledge the truth beneath all illusions. To honor him was to accept that life is fragile, fleeting, sacred only because it ends. His skull was the mirror of humanity, his silence the weight of eternity, his owls the heralds of truth. And though men trembled, they also understood. Death was not their enemy. Death was their teacher. Ah Puch was not destruction alone, but balance, the shadow that gives meaning to light, the silence that gives weight to song, the ending that allows beginnings to be born. Thus, in the great weaving of the cosmos, the first thread of mortality was placed. And in that moment, the eternal cycle began. The birth of death, the rise of Ah Puch, the Lord of Xibalbá. Beneath the skin of the earth, in caverns where no light of sun could reach, lay the terrible kingdom of Xibalbá. Its halls stretched endlessly, carved not of stone but of shadow, adorned not with jewels but with skulls. Rivers of darkness coiled like serpents through its passages, and the very air was heavy with silence, as though every breath were weighed and measured. Here sat Ah Puch upon his throne of bones, presiding over a court unlike any in the world of the living. For where kings of men were adorned with gold and feathers, the lords of Xibalbá wore necklaces of entrails, crowns of skulls, and garments stitched from human skin. Their laughter was hollow, their steps echoed like falling stones, and their feasts were not of fruit and maize but of decay and silence. They were countless, yet each bore a title, each a domain within the endless tapestry of death. Together they formed the machinery of dissolution, each a cog in the great wheel that ground life into dust. And though each was feared, all bent their heads before Ah Puch, for he was not merely one among them, but the embodiment of death itself, the axis upon which their realm turned. The Maya spoke of many lords who walked the halls of Xibalbá, each embodying an aspect of suffering. They were 13 in number, though their faces were countless, shadows that multiplied and shifted with the needs of death. Among them were the lords of illness, who spread fevers through the breath of men. The lords of poverty who stripped homes bare until hunger gnawed at the bones. The lords of fear who haunted dreams and silenced hearts. The lords of putrefaction who presided over the slow unraveling of flesh. Each lord bore a name that was not uttered lightly, for to speak it was to invite their presence. Their footsteps echoed across the world of men as sickness, famine, despair, and ruin. Their weapons were not spears or arrows, but shadows that crept into lungs, winds that carried plague, silences that drained courage. And yet, as terrible as they were, none reigned above Ah Puch. For he was the silence into which all their works dissolved, the throne upon which their titles rested, the skull in whose sockets all their powers found their reflection. To reach the throne of Ah Puch, the soul was forced to pass through the houses of trial, each ruled by one or more of the lords of death. These were not places of stone, but living terrors, realms that devoured the spirit. The house of darkness was the first, where not even a spark of fire endured. Here souls stumbled blind, their own thoughts echoing like predators. The house of cold came next, its air sharp as obsidian, where frost gnawed at bones and froze blood within veins. The house of jaguars was filled with eyes that glowed in the dark, and teeth that closed upon those who faltered. The house of knives sang with blades suspended in the air, each whispering as it cut through shadow. The house of fire consumed without mercy, where flames roared but gave no warmth, only endless burning. Each house was a mirror of the world above. Darkness reminded mortals of ignorance, cold of isolation, knives of betrayal, fire of rage. In passing through them, souls were stripped of illusion until they stood bare before the throne. For Ah Puch did not desire offerings of wealth or strength. He demanded truth, and the houses of trial carved it from the flesh of the dead. The lords of Xibalbá were not solemn judges alone. They were mockers, tricksters, revelers in human weakness. Their laughter filled the halls like drums, booming and hollow, shaking the souls who trembled before them. They delighted in deceit, sending false messengers, shaping illusions, setting traps for the living who dared enter their realm. But their laughter was not mere cruelty. It was reflection. For they mocked the arrogance of men who believed themselves eternal, who walked as though death were distant. In laughter, the lords reminded mortals of their folly, stripping them of pride until humility was all that remained. Yet their mirth was also terror. To hear the laughter of Xibalbá was to feel one's soul unravel, as though each chuckle were a blade cutting away flesh. No man, no woman, no child could stand against it. For it was not sound alone, but the echo of truth, that all who live are fragile, all who breathe are temporary, all who rejoice will one day fall silent. Before the lords themselves appeared, heralds walked among men. They were the owls circling rooftops in silence, their cries sharp as bone flutes. They were bats that swept through the night, their wings whispering like cloth over corpses. They were winds that carried sickness, shadows that slipped beneath doors, dreams that curdled into terror. The heralds did not kill. They announced. They were the bells of Ah Puch ringing in the world of the living, warning that the throne of Xibalbá was near. Farmers in the fields, hunters in the forest, kings in their palaces, all heard the heralds and all knew their meaning. Death approached and no barrier could hold it back. In this way the lords of Xibalbá extended their reach. They did not need to leave their halls. Their heralds carried their presence into every corner of the earth. The cry of an owl, the flutter of a bat, the whisper of fever. These were the voices of the underworld, reminding men of the covenant they could not escape. Among the court of death, those who carried pestilence were among the most feared. They were the lords of sickness, draped in garments woven from skin, their eyes hollow like pits of obsidian. Where they walked, the air grew heavy, fever spread like wildfire, and the breath of mortals faltered. Their gift was weakness. They entered homes silently, moving with the air, slipping into lungs and blood. Children burned with heat, elders shivered with chills, warriors collapsed before battle. The Maya saw their hand in every cough, every trembling body, every grave dug in haste. Yet their work was not chaos. It was balance. By their touch, the numbers of the living were thinned, the arrogance of kings humbled, the fragile truth of flesh revealed. For without sickness, men would forget their mortality. The lords of sickness ensured that Ah Puch's truth was never far from mind. Their laughter was faint but constant, echoing through fevered dreams. Those who heard it knew that the court of Xibalbá was near, and that their bodies had already begun to crumble into the silence of eternity. Hunger was another mask of death. The lords of hunger sat gaunt and skeletal, their ribs visible beneath flesh that clung like parchment. Their presence was felt not in shadows, but in empty granaries, barren fields, and the hollow eyes of starving children. They did not strike with sudden violence, but with slow inevitability. Each day without food was another step into their arms. Maize withered in drought, beans shriveled on the vine, fish vanished from rivers, and the people cried out. The lords of hunger were there, feeding not on flesh but on despair, feasting upon the cries of the living. Yet hunger too was part of the cycle. It reminded mortals of their dependence upon the gods, upon the rains of Chak, upon the gifts of Yum Cox, and upon the balance that Ah Puch preserved. Hunger was not only absence but discipline. It stripped men of arrogance, teaching humility, forcing them to see that survival was not theirs alone to command. The lords of hunger never needed to lift a hand. Their dominion was silence, the silence of empty stomachs, the silence of fields without harvest, the silence of men too weak to cry. If sickness weakened the flesh and hunger hollowed it, decay completed the work. The lords of decay were sculptors of corruption. Their crowns were made of rotting flowers, their necklaces of worms, their thrones of swollen corpses. They presided over the final unraveling of the body, ensuring that nothing of life endured in form. They delighted in the slow transformation. Flesh softening into soil, hair falling like withered grass, bones emerging like white roots from the earth. Every stage of rot was their hymn, every stench their incense. Where men saw horror, they saw beauty, the sacred dismantling of life into silence. Decay was not an end but a return. The lords of decay carried the body back into the arms of the earth, feeding worms, enriching soil, preparing the ground for maize and renewal. They were not destroyers but keepers of continuity. Without them, the earth would choke upon corpses and no seed could grow. Thus, though feared, they were also revered. For in their work lay the promise of rebirth, hidden in the silent feast of the soil. Among the most insidious were the lords of terror. They struck not with disease, nor hunger, nor rot, but with fear itself. They moved through dreams, conjuring visions of owls, bats, and shadows that pressed upon the chest until breath faltered. They whispered doubts into hearts, drained courage from warriors, and sowed despair in families. Their presence could be felt in the sudden hush of the jungle, in the coldness that filled a room without wind, in the glance of shadows that lingered too long. They required no weapon, for fear itself was death's first herald. When men froze in terror, unable to move, unable to act, the lords of terror fed upon their paralysis. The Maya honored them in silence, for even to speak their names was to summon dread. They were reminders that death does not always arrive with warning, but with a breath that freezes the soul. And in that stillness, the truth of mortality was revealed. Perhaps most terrible of all were the lords of mockery. They were the tricksters of Xibalbá, delighting in humiliation. They placed false idols upon roads, leading men astray. They sent illusions to confuse travelers, laughter to mock the dying, and false dreams to torment the hopeful. Their cruelty was not mindless. It was a mirror held to mortals, showing them their pride, their folly, their illusions of permanence. They stripped kings of dignity, mocked warriors with their own weakness, and laughed at the arrogance of those who thought themselves beyond death's reach. Their laughter rang in caverns, in sickness, in famine, in war. To hear it was to feel one's soul unravel, as though each note was a blade cutting through pride. They were the reminder that all strength, all beauty, all power was fleeting, and that in the end all would be reduced to silence and bone. The Maya feared them most, for their laughter was the sound of truth made unbearable. When a mortal drew their final breath and the body was surrendered to the worms and the soil, the soul began its long descent toward Xibalbá. This path was not swift nor merciful. It was a journey through darkness, a pilgrimage into silence, a trial where every step revealed the fragility of the human spirit. The journey began with the crossing of rivers. Some were rivers of blood, flowing thick and red, carrying the scent of sacrifice. Others were rivers of pus and filth, heavy with the waste of corruption. Still others were cold streams that froze the essence of the soul, making each step a burden. To stumble was to be consumed, to cross was to emerge weakened, stripped of illusion. Beyond the rivers came crossroads where paths split in many directions, each promising escape, yet only one leading onward. The soul, burdened by confusion, wandered endlessly, for the lords of mockery delighted in scattering false trails. Each wrong step led back to the beginning, forcing the traveler to confront despair. It was said that even the bravest grew weary in these trials, that even kings and warriors wept like children in the endless night. For the path of the soul was not designed for victory, but for surrender. Surrender to truth, surrender to silence, surrender to the inevitability of death's throne. Among the most dreaded trials was the House of Darkness. Here, the soul entered a chamber where no flame could survive, where even the glow of stars was absent. The darkness was not mere absence of light, but a presence in itself, a living weight that pressed upon the spirit. In this place, the soul heard only its own breath, only the pounding of its essence against the silence. Fear multiplied, shadows of memory rose, and illusions of the past taunted the traveler. The house of darkness revealed not what lay before the soul, but what lay within it. Regrets returned, failures whispered, fears became fleshless phantoms that clutched and dragged. Those who entered emerged shattered if they emerged at all. For in darkness there is no guide, no companion, only the truth of one's own weakness. Ah Puch, seated far beyond, smiled in silence, for this was his teaching, that the final judgment comes not from without, but from within. If darkness stripped away pride, cold stripped away strength. The house of cold was a place where frost clung to the very marrow, where winds cut through the soul like knives. Breath became pain, limbs stiffened, and the spirit trembled with each step. The cold was not simply physical. It was the cold of isolation, the frost of abandonment, the chill of being forgotten. Here, souls felt the despair of those who die alone, whose names fade into silence, whose memory does not endure. It was the terror of becoming nothing, not even a whisper in the world of the living. The lords of cold rejoiced in this house, for their laughter was the cracking of ice, sharp and merciless. To endure their trial was to surrender pride and companionship, to learn that all must pass alone into Xibalbá. For though families mourned and names were carved, the final step was solitary. Death was always alone. Within the jungle of the underworld roamed the lords of jaguars. Their house was filled with eyes gleaming in the dark, with low growls that echoed from unseen throats. The jaguars circled the soul as hunters circle prey, patient and relentless. Here fear took form. The soul felt teeth at its throat, claws at its flesh, yet no escape was possible. The jaguars were not beasts of flesh, but embodiments of violence, reminders that life is always stalked by death, that every step is shadowed by unseen predators. Some souls fled, only to stumble into the jaws of another. Others froze, and the jaguars feasted upon their essence until only silence remained. Those who endured emerged scarred, for to survive the house of jaguars was to accept the truth, that all life is prey, and all prey is destined for the jaws of death. Beyond the jungle lay the house of knives, a place where blades floated in the air, spinning and whispering like voices of judgment. Each knife glimmered with light stolen from the stars, and each moved with purpose, cutting without mercy. The soul could not pass without being wounded. Every step drew blood, every breath carried pain. The knives were not weapons but truths sharpened into form, the truth that flesh is fragile, that bodies are temples built to fall. Each cut stripped away illusion, carving the soul into the shape of what it truly was. Those who fell were consumed by the knives, reduced to fragments scattered across the floor of the underworld. Those who passed carried scars that could not heal, reminders that pain is not an enemy, but a teacher, shaping the soul for its final audience before Ah Puch. Last among the great trials was the house of fire. Here, flames rose without smoke, devouring air itself. The soul entered, and heat consumed it from within. Yet these flames did not warm. They burned cold, searing not the flesh but the essence of the spirit. The fire was hunger, rage, memory. It was the fury of death itself, consuming all that clung to life. In its roar, the soul heard the cries of ancestors, the voices of the lost, the endless hymn of mortality. No soul could leave unchanged, for to endure the house of fire was to surrender fully, to let go of all ties, all desires, all remnants of the living world. And when the flames subsided, when ashes fell silent upon the ground, the soul was prepared, stripped of pride, scarred by pain, humbled by fear, emptied of all but truth. Only then could it approach the throne of Ah Puch. At the heart of Xibalbá lay the throne of bones. It was carved from skulls stacked high, draped with entrails like banners, crowned with serpents whose eyes burned faintly in the gloom. Upon it sat Ah Puch, motionless, his skull face gazing without blink, his bells ringing softly in the silence. The soul, trembling, scarred by trials, entered his hall. Around him sat the lords of death, their eyes hollow, their laughter faint. The heralds, owls, bats, shadows, perched silently watching. The throne did not move, yet its presence pressed upon the soul like a mountain. No words were spoken, for Ah Puch did not require speech. His silence was judgment enough. His gaze stripped away all that remained, leaving only essence, bare and unhidden. And in that moment the soul knew that death was not punishment but truth. For before the throne of Ah Puch, all illusions died. The lords of Xibalbá were not confined to the caverns below. Their presence was reflected in the cosmos, etched upon the stars, woven into the movements of the heavens. The Maya raised their eyes to the night sky and saw death inscribed in constellations that rose and fell, in eclipses that swallowed the sun, in the waning of the moon. Each eclipse was a veil of Ah Puch drawn across the heavens, a reminder that even celestial fire must one day fade. Each meteor was a fragment of the sky consumed, bones of the firmament falling to earth. Even the Milky Way, stretching across the night, was seen as a great river, a mirror of the dark currents that flowed through Xibalbá. Thus, death was not only beneath but above, surrounding mortals on every side. To look upward was to remember the throne below, for the same rhythm that drew stars into darkness drew souls into silence. The lords of Xibalbá reigned not only in caverns, but in the endless turning of the heavens. In the world of the living, the lords of Xibalbá were honored through rituals meant to acknowledge their dominion. These were not festivals of joy, but ceremonies of reverence and fear. Priests painted their bodies with black and white, their faces shaped into skulls. They burned copal and blood upon altars, letting the smoke rise toward the sky even as their offerings sank into the earth. Human sacrifice was the highest form of offering, for the body itself belonged to Ah Puch and his court. Victims were adorned with bells, their descent into death echoing the ornaments of the Lord himself. Their skulls were preserved, their bones arranged, their memory woven into the fabric of ritual. Even ordinary funerals echoed this truth. A grain of maize was placed in the mouth of the dead, a final offering for the journey into Xibalbá. Water was poured over the body, guiding it toward the rivers of the underworld. Families wept, yet their grief was a prayer, acknowledging the Lord's dominion and pleading for mercy upon the soul. In every ritual, the truth was the same. The lords were not enemies to be defeated, but powers to be respected, acknowledged, and appeased. The lords of Xibalbá fed not only on flesh but on memory. The forgotten dead, those whose names were not spoken, whose graves were untended, whose offerings were neglected, were said to wander endlessly in the underworld, lost in silence. For memory was life's final tether, and without it, the soul was consumed entirely by Ah Puch's court. The lords of abandonment whispered in forgotten tombs, laughing over graves left barren. They were the cold that clung to unvisited bones, the emptiness of cenotes left without offerings. Thus remembrance became survival. The Maya carved names, honored ancestors, kept bones within households, and carried memory through generations. To forget was to condemn, and to condemn was to feed Ah Puch more than he was owed. The lords of abandonment were feared, for they reminded the living that neglect of the dead was a sin against balance itself. In visions and dreams, shamans spoke of the eternal procession that moved through Xibalbá. It was said that all souls, from the first man to the last yet unborn, walked in endless line toward the throne of Ah Puch. The path wound through caverns and rivers, through houses of trial and halls of mockery, a procession without end. Each soul carried the weight of its life, some bowed beneath burdens of pride, others staggered with chains of regret. Yet all moved forward, drawn by the silent bells of Ah Puch, which rang beyond the horizon of death. The lords of Xibalbá lined the path, mocking, testing, stripping, until nothing remained but truth. The procession never ceased. Even as the living world celebrated, planted, harvested, built, and destroyed, the dead marched below, step by step, into the silence of eternity. This vision was not terror but reality. For to the Maya, life and death were not separate realms, but layers of the same existence. While the living feasted, the dead marched. While rain fell, bones crumbled. While maize grew, skulls stared in silence. The procession was eternal, the rhythm unbroken. Though Ah Puch sat supreme, the court of Xibalbá was a balance of forces. The lords of sickness, hunger, decay, terror, mockery, and abandonment each played their part, ensuring that no death was without meaning, no life without shadow. Together they wove the tapestry of mortality, a net in which all creatures were caught. Yet their power was not absolute. For life too had its lords, Chak with his rains, Yum Cox with his maize, Kinichahau with his sun. The struggle between life and death was eternal, not of enemies seeking destruction, but of forces seeking balance. Without rain there was famine, without maize there was death. Without death there was no renewal. Thus the Maya saw existence not as war but as covenant. The lords of life and the lords of death were partners in an eternal dance, each step measured, each cycle sacred. At last, beyond rivers, houses, and trials, stood the throne of silence. Upon it, Ah Puch gazed with eyes that did not blink, skull grinning with eternal patience. Around him sat the lords, their laughter subdued, their power humbled in his presence. For though each carried dominion, all bowed before the sovereign of endings. The soul, stripped of illusion, scarred by trial, bowed as well. And in that bow was truth, that all paths led here, that all songs ended here, that all maize, all rain, all sun, all kings, all peasants, all children ended here. Ah Puch did not speak, for speech was unnecessary. His silence was more than words, his stillness heavier than judgment. In that silence, the soul dissolved, becoming part of the eternal storm of death, part of the endless procession, part of the truth that none could escape. Thus reigned the lords of Xibalbá, guardians of the underworld, keepers of silence, mockers of pride, sculptors of decay. Their court was a mirror of the living world, reflecting its weakness, its hunger, its fear. Their laughter was the echo of mortality, their trials the stripping of illusion, their silence the truth beneath all things. And above them all sat Ah Puch, sovereign of skulls, ruler of the throne of bones, master of the eternal balance. His reign was not of cruelty but of inevitability, not of malice but of truth. For as long as men lived, he would reign, and when men ceased he would remain, eternal, unbroken, absolute. Thus ended the second vision, the revelation of the court of death. And thus was remembered the covenant, that life and death are not enemies but twins, bound in eternal dance beneath the gaze of Ah Puch. In the deep silence of night, when the last flames of hearts had burned low and the stars alone watched the sleeping earth, a sound rose that froze blood in the veins of men, the cry of the owl. It was not the cry of a creature merely hunting its prey. It was a call that seemed to pierce the soul, sharp, unearthly, echoing as though it came not from branches but from the underworld itself. To the Maya the owl was no ordinary bird. It was the herald of Ah Puch, the first whisper of his presence. Its round eyes, glowing in the dark, were said to reflect not the fires of the living but the flames of Xibalbá. Its wings moved in silence, unseen and unheard until the cry shattered the night. Where the owl flew, death followed. Where it perched, the bells of Ah Puch were already ringing. Thus the owl was feared more than jaguars, more than serpents, more than the shadows of the jungle. For its presence was not the threat of injury, but the certainty of death's approach. The eyes of the owl were mirrors of the skull, unblinking, round, and eternal. They were said to see beyond the flesh, beyond the masks of life, into the truth of mortality. No shadow could hide from them, no secret endure. When an owl fixed its gaze upon a man, it was not looking at his body but at his soul, measuring its weight in the halls of Xibalbá. The Maya whispered that Ah Puch himself sometimes borrowed the eyes of owls to see the world of the living. Through them he watched the sick, the hungry, the dying. Through them he marked those whose time had come. To feel the gaze of an owl was to feel the gaze of death, cold and unyielding. For this reason, owls became symbols of the underworld. Their feathers were used in rituals of death, their cries echoed in funeral songs, their images painted upon vessels buried with the dead. They were not worshipped as gods, but acknowledged as bridges, messengers, heralds of the inevitable. The cry of the owl was more than sound. It was omen. When it rang through villages, mothers clutched their children, elders whispered prayers, and priests burned copal to ward off the approach of death. The cry was said to announce a soul's departure, to call the attention of Ah Puch, to open the path toward Xibalbá. Each cry was a bell of the underworld, each echo a step in the eternal procession of souls. Sometimes it was heard once, sometimes 3 times, sometimes endlessly until dawn rose. The number of cries was read as prophecy, the measure of how soon death would arrive. In this way the night itself became an oracle and the owl its voice. Men lay awake in silence, fearing not jaguars nor serpents but the sudden cry that tore through darkness. For to hear it was to know that Ah Puch had stretched his hand into the world of the living. Yet the owl was not only an omen of fear, it was also a guide. Just as it moved silently through night, it was believed to guide souls silently through the paths of Xibalbá. Its wings carried the dead across rivers, its eyes lit the way through the house of darkness, its cry silenced the laughter of mocking lords. To the Maya this duality was sacred. The owl was terror but also mercy. Its presence meant death but also passage. Without it, souls would wander lost, prey to the mockery of lesser lords, never reaching the throne of Ah Puch. With it, the soul moved swiftly, carried on wings that knew the secret paths of night. Thus, some offerings were made to owls, not in worship but in gratitude. Feathers were placed upon corpses, small images buried with the dead, prayers whispered to the winged herald that it might guide the soul swiftly and without torment. Dreams were said to belong to the night, and the night belonged to Ah Puch. When an owl cried, it was believed to slip into the dreams of the sleeping, carrying with it visions of death. The dreamer might see skulls, rivers of shadow, houses of knives and fire, or the throne of silence itself. Such dreams were not dismissed, but treated as messages, warnings, or even rehearsals of what awaited beyond life. The owl's cry wove death into sleep, binding the living to Xibalbá even before their final breath. In this way no one escaped its touch. The child dreaming of shadows, the elder hearing wings outside his hut, the priest waking to the echo of cries, all were visited by the owl, all were reminded of the balance. Dreams became another road between worlds, and owls were their guardians, their ferrymen. They carried visions from Ah Puch into the hearts of the living, ensuring that even in sleep, men remembered their mortality. The owl was not only the herald of death but the sentinel of tombs. It was said that when bodies were laid to rest, whether beneath earth, within caves, or in the sacred waters of cenotes, owls perched nearby, their round eyes gleaming in the night. They were the watchers of silence, guardians that ensured the passage from life into death was not disturbed. Graveyards and burial caves often echoed with their cries. The Maya saw this not as coincidence but as covenant. The owl did not feast upon the dead, it kept vigil. Its presence was the seal of Ah Puch, marking the place as sacred ground. Its wings carried prayers into Xibalbá, and its cry reminded the living that they stood on the threshold of the underworld. Thus, in funerary rites, images of owls were carved upon vessels, painted upon walls and invoked in chants. The owl was the silent priest of Ah Puch, presiding over death not with words but with unblinking gaze and piercing cry. The moon was often linked to the owl, for both ruled the night and both bore the mark of death. The owl's eyes were like twin moons, glowing in the darkness, and the moon itself was seen as an immense owl watching over the earth. When the moon waned, its fading light was said to be the cry of owls carrying souls into Xibalbá. When the moon was eclipsed, owls were believed to gather in great numbers, their wings blotting out the sky, their cries uniting into a chorus of death. These nights were feared, for they meant Ah Puch was closest, his heralds circling the world above. The connection between moon and owl made the night a domain of death's power. Each phase of the moon was a stage in mortality, fullness as life, waning as decay, darkness as death, and the return of light as rebirth. And in each stage the owl flew, its presence unbroken, its message eternal. Deep within the jungle, owls perched upon ceiba trees, their forms barely visible against the branches, their cries piercing through the layers of sound. Jaguars roared, monkeys howled, insects hummed, yet the cry of the owl silenced all. Even the beasts of the forest seemed to bow before its call, as if recognizing that death itself had spoken. Hunters who heard owls at night often abandoned their pursuit, for to kill under the shadow of the owl was to invite death upon oneself. Travelers prayed when owls flew overhead, asking not for protection but for acknowledgement, so that their souls might one day be guided gently. The owl belonged to the jungle as much as vines, rivers, and roots. But unlike them, it carried no nourishment, no fruit, no healing. It carried only silence, only endings. Its flight was the shadow that followed all life, a reminder that the forest itself was filled with the breath of Xibalbá. In rituals of death, the owl was ever present. Priests wore headdresses of feathers shaped like wings, their masks painted with large round eyes. Dancers imitated the movements of owls, their steps jerking and sudden, their arms spread wide as though wings beat through the night. Chants were whispered in imitation of the owl's cry, rising and falling like echoes in a cavern. Fires burned low, their smoke curling upward as if following wings into darkness. Offerings of feathers were cast into cenotes, so that owls might guide the dead through rivers of the underworld. Even in daily life the presence of owls was honored. If an owl perched upon a rooftop, it was not driven away. Food was sometimes left for it, not because owls required it, but because the gesture was seen as recognition of the herald. For to acknowledge the owl was to acknowledge Ah Puch, and to ignore it was to risk his wrath. Fear itself was said to ride upon the wings of owls. Their silent flight was not only physical but spiritual, slipping into the hearts of men without warning. A single cry in the night could fill a village with dread, its sound lingering long after silence returned. This fear was not seen as weakness, but as wisdom. It reminded mortals that they lived beneath the gaze of death, that each breath was temporary, that each heartbeat echoed in halls already prepared for them. To fear the owl was to remember one's place in the cycle, to accept humility before the throne of bones. Thus fear was sacred. It was the shadow that gave meaning to courage, the silence that gave weight to song, the darkness that gave brilliance to fire. The owl carried this sacred fear, delivering it in cries that pierced both night and soul. The Maya believed that dreams were doorways, passages through which the soul wandered freely, touching both the world of the living and the corridors of Xibalbá. Within these nocturnal journeys the owl was a constant presence. Its shadow passed silently through dreamscapes, its cry broke the fragile walls between sleep and death, its gaze revealed hidden truths. To dream of an owl was to receive a visitation from the underworld. Sometimes it was a warning, a prophecy of illness or death soon to come. Sometimes it was a summons, a reminder that one's days were counted and the bells of Ah Puch already rang. In rare moments, it was guidance, a protective presence showing the dreamer how to walk the trials of Xibalbá before they faced them in reality. Shamans interpreted owl dreams as sacred texts. They read the angle of wings, the number of cries, the flight across the moon. Each detail was a glyph written in shadow, a message from Ah Puch delivered through his winged herald. Thus, even sleep belonged not to rest but to the eternal covenant of life and death. There were times when death came not with sickness, nor hunger, nor age, but swiftly, a fall from a tree, the strike of lightning, the tooth of a serpent, the thrust of a spear. Such sudden deaths were said to be heralded by owls. The Maya whispered that before such a death, an owl would circle unseen, its wings brushing against the soul, its cry piercing the air. Those who heard it too late would fall without warning, their breath torn away, their hearts silenced in an instant. Owls were thus the messengers of sudden death, reminding mortals that life was not promised even for the next breath. The cry that echoed across the jungle was not only omen but decree. To hear it was to know that Ah Puch had extended his hand, that a place had opened in the procession of Xibalbá. In times of war, the cry of the owl was dreaded above all. Before battle, warriors prayed for the strength of Kinich, for the rains of Chak, for the blessings of Yum Cox. But if an owl circled the encampment, its cry piercing the night, silence fell upon the army. For it meant that many would not see dawn, that the fields of battle would soon be harvested by Ah Puch. Owls were said to follow armies not for carrion but for souls. Their wings circled over rivers of blood, their cries rose above the clash of obsidian blades. They were the heralds of defeat, the companions of massacre, the witnesses of sacrifice. Yet some warriors painted owls upon their shields, believing that to embrace death was to master it. For if death was inevitable, then to march under the wings of the owl was to walk already in covenant with Ah Puch. In this way the owl became both terror and protection, a symbol of mortality accepted with honor. When victims were chosen for sacrifice, the presence of owls was considered sacred. Priests often imitated their cries, summoning the heralds of Ah Puch to witness the offering. Feathers were placed upon the bodies of the sacrificed, so that the owl might guide their souls swiftly through Xibalbá. The sacrifice itself was often seen as a gift to both life and death. The blood fed the gods of maize and rain, while the body was surrendered to Ah Puch. The owl was mediator, carrying the essence of the victim into the underworld, ensuring the offering reached its true destination. In this way, sacrifice was not an act of destruction, but of transformation. The cry of the owl sealed the ritual, a sound that echoed through temples and plazas, binding the living to the dead, the mortal to the eternal. The owl was not bound to the past. Its presence endured, whispered through generations, lingering in the collective memory of the Maya. Even after cities fell silent, after temples were swallowed by the jungle, after languages faded and rituals ceased, the cry of the owl remained. It still echoes in the jungles of the Yucatan, piercing the silence of night. Travelers hear it and feel unease even if they do not remember why. Farmers pause when it cries above their fields, sensing an ancient covenant they no longer name. Children wake from dreams of feathers and skulls, unaware that they have walked paths traced by their ancestors. The owl is eternal because death is eternal. Its cry is older than kingdoms, older than maize, older than memory. It is the shadow that follows humanity, the echo of Ah Puch carried on wings. Even now, its presence is the reminder that death has never departed, that the throne of bones still waits, that the procession of souls still marches endlessly beneath the earth. Thus the owl was more than bird. It was herald, guardian, dream, terror, and guide. Its eyes were the moons of the underworld, its wings the silence of death, its cry the bell of Ah Puch ringing across the night. The Maya saw in it the face of mortality, the whisper of endings. They feared it, but they also revered it. For in its shadow lay truth, that every breath is fragile, that every life is borrowed, that every man walks already beneath wings unseen. And so, when the night falls and the owl cries, the covenant is remembered. Ah Puch stretches his gaze into the world of the living, and his herald speaks with a voice that no man can deny. The owl is death's eternal shadow. Its flight is unending. Its cry is forever. In the halls of Xibalbá, there was no feast of fruits nor of honey, no banquet of maize nor cacao. The lords of death dined only upon silence, only upon the essence of the departed. Their tables were bones, their vessels were skulls, their incense the stench of decay. Ah Puch presided over this banquet as master and sovereign. Where the gods of life were fed by offerings of blood and maize, Ah Puch was fed by the passage of souls, by the return of flesh to soil, by the endless unraveling of all living things. His feast was not chosen but inevitable, for every man, woman, and child, whether king or peasant, whether warrior or priest, would one day serve as his portion. This was the Feast of Bones, the eternal consumption of life into death, the banquet where silence itself was devoured. When death touched a household, rituals unfolded like sacred theater. The body was washed, its flesh anointed with perfumes, its face painted with symbols of bone. Jade beads were placed in its mouth, seeds of maize laid upon its chest, water poured upon its skin. These were not adornments but offerings, gifts for the journey, tributes to Ah Puch. Priests chanted in low voices, their words weaving a bridge between the world of the living and Xibalbá. Families wept not only in grief but as ritual, for tears were seen as libations poured for the dead. The body was then lowered into earth or into cenotes, or sealed within caves where darkness embraced it as a womb. Each funeral was not merely farewell but sacrifice. For the dead belonged to Ah Puch, and to bury them was to acknowledge his claim, to surrender flesh and bone to his eternal feast. Beyond funerals, sacrifices were given to Ah Puch with deliberate purpose. In times of plague, famine, or war, victims were chosen not only for Chak or Yum Cox, but also for the Lord of the underworld. Painted in black and white, adorned with feathers of owls and bats, they were led to altars where their blood flowed into the earth, their bodies cast into sacred wells, their bones preserved as relics. Sacrifice was not cruelty but necessity. It was the renewal of covenant, the acknowledgement that death was part of the cycle. The people did not see the victim as lost, but as messenger, carried on the wings of owls into the halls of Xibalbá, where Ah Puch received them as honored guests. The spilling of blood was both prayer and nourishment, for in its steam rose the essence of life, and in its silence descended the shadow of death. Each sacrifice fed not only gods of fertility, but also the sovereign of endings. Bones were among the most sacred of offerings. They were polished and carved into flutes whose hollow sound echoed the whispers of the underworld. They were arranged upon altars, painted with red and black, adorned with jade beads, transformed into vessels of sacred memory. In some rituals, bones were burned, the smoke rising into the night like the breath of ancestors. In others, they were buried beneath temples, placed at the foundation of new structures, ensuring that every stone rested upon death, every building rooted in mortality. Skulls were often preserved, displayed in racks known as tsimpantli, a wall of faces grinning eternally. These were not monuments of cruelty but of truth, the acknowledgement that beneath every living face lies the mask of death. Each skull was a sermon, each row of teeth a hymn to Ah Puch. Cenotes were mouths of the earth, doorways into Xibalbá, sacred wells that drank the offerings of men. Into their depths were cast jade, gold, food, and bodies, all gifts for the lords of death. The waters swallowed them in silence, carrying them into rivers that flowed unseen beneath the world. At night, when torches flickered and drums beat low, processions approached the cenotes. Priests chanted, families wept, victims trembled. Then the offering was made, the plunge into darkness, the splash swallowed by silence, the return of life to death. The cenote was both tomb and altar. Its waters reflected the stars, its depths held the bones of countless generations. To look into it was to gaze into the mouth of Ah Puch himself, to see the shadow of Xibalbá yawning beneath. Within the underworld, the lords of death gathered at the banquet of bones. They did not eat as mortals ate but consumed essence. Sickness fed them, famine nourished them, decay sustained them. Every life lost in battle, every child taken by fever, every elder fading in silence, all became part of their feast. Ah Puch sat at the head of this eternal table, his bells ringing softly as he received each soul. He did not hunger, for his appetite was infinite. He did not thirst, for his drink was the silence of breath. His feast was endless, his table eternal, his guests all who lived. The lords laughed as they ate, their mockery echoing through caverns, their joy found not in cruelty but in certainty. For they knew that the feast would never end, that no famine could starve them, that no drought could withhold their portion. As long as men were born, the table would remain full. The Maya did not see the body as merely ending in decay, but as undergoing transformation. Flesh that softened became food for the earth, blood that spilled became water for the fields, bones that endured became relics of eternity. Death was a feast in which the world itself dined, consuming and renewing, turning endings into beginnings. Ah Puch was the sovereign of this transformation. His touch was the spark that began the unraveling of flesh. His silence was the chant that accompanied the fall of blood into soil. His throne was the loom upon which death wove life back into the cycle. Thus each body was both guest and offering at his table. To die was not to vanish, but to become sustenance, to be absorbed into the feast of bones that nourished not only the lords of Xibalbá, but the earth itself. The people of Maize understood that Ah Puch's feast was not confined to funerals or sacrifices. It was daily, woven into the very rhythm of life. Each stalk of maize cut was a life surrendered, each animal hunted a soul claimed, each sickness a quiet offering. The act of eating was itself participation in his banquet, for the living dined upon what had already died. To grind maize upon stone was to echo the grinding of bones in the halls of Xibalbá. To drink a toll was to sip the essence of life transformed through death. The table of men was the reflection of the table of Ah Puch, each meal a reminder that the living were always bound to the feast of the dead. Thus, every act of survival was also an acknowledgement of death. To live was to partake in the banquet of mortality, to consume as one would one day be consumed. Festivals of death often mirrored the feast of the underworld. Families gathered with offerings of food, drinks, and incense, not for themselves but for their ancestors. They placed bowls of maize, cacao, and tamales upon altars, believing that the essence of these meals traveled into Xibalbá, feeding the souls who had departed. The living ate as well, but their feasting was not indulgence, it was communion. Each bite was shared with the dead, each sip a gesture of remembrance. In laughter and tears, the people of Maize acknowledged that their table was joined invisibly to the table of Ah Puch, that the feast of bones united all generations in one endless banquet. Thus, death was not only mourned but celebrated. For in sharing food with the departed, the living reminded themselves that they too were part of the feast, that they too would one day sit in silence beneath the gaze of the skull lord. Even kings, adorned with jade and feathers, were not exempt from the feast of bones. Their bodies, placed in tombs filled with treasures, still belonged to Ah Puch. Gold tarnished, jade cracked, feathers withered, only bones remained, and even they crumbled into dust. Yet royal burials were spectacles meant to honor the inevitability of death. Great feasts were held before the tomb was sealed, with dancers painted as skeletons and priests chanting the names of the lords of Xibalbá. The king's final meal was offered not to him but through him to Ah Puch. His flesh became covenant, his death a banquet to remind the living that even rulers are swallowed by silence. In this way kings were humbled, their thrones no higher than the throne of bones beneath the earth. For Ah Puch reigned above them, sovereign not of one city or dynasty, but of eternity itself. The greatest banquet of Ah Puch was not of flesh or bone, but of time itself. For every day that passed, every breath drawn, every heartbeat spent was consumed by him. Time was his endless meal, devoured silently, second by second, until all lives were reduced to echoes. The Maya understood this truth in their calendars. Each cycle of days was a step toward death, each rotation of the sun a reminder that the feast continued. Festivals and rituals did not delay this consumption. They sanctified it, turning the devouring of time into sacred offering. Thus, Ah Puch was not only Lord of Bones but Lord of Years, Eater of Days, sovereign of the unrelenting flow that carried all things into his halls. His hunger was patient, his feast eternal, his table set with the hours and minutes of all who lived. Every banquet ends in silence, and so too did the feasts of the underworld. When blood ceased to flow, when bodies were lowered into earth, when incense burned to ash, silence remained. This silence was not absence, but fullness, the presence of Ah Puch, seated in stillness, satisfied yet eternal. The Maya feared this silence, yet they also revered it. For in silence lay the truth of death, that no song endures forever, that no voice outlasts the grave. Silence was the final guest at every meal, the last course of every feast. And so, when the drums ceased and the chants faded, the people bowed their heads, knowing that Ah Puch had eaten, that his table was satisfied, that the covenant of mortality had been renewed once more. Death was not confined to men alone. All the world participated in the Feast of Bones. Leaves fell and rotted upon the jungle floor, their veins breaking into soil. Animals perished and became food for serpents, insects, and the creeping vines of the forest. Even mountains crumbled, their faces eaten away by rain and wind, as though the very earth itself were a dish set upon the table of Ah Puch. Decay was the universal banquet. It fed worms and roots, nourished rivers and skies. What men saw as ruin was simply transformation, the great meal of the cosmos. And at the center of this feast sat Ah Puch, not as destroyer, but as sovereign of balance, ensuring that nothing endured beyond its time, that all things returned to silence. The Maya, gazing upon the jungle, did not see only life, but also the banquet of death woven into every leaf and stone. For in each ruin lay the hand of Ah Puch, patiently consuming, patiently renewing. In festivals of death, the people reenacted the feast through dance. Men and women painted their bodies in white, drawing black lines upon their skin to resemble bones. Their faces became skulls, their movements slow and jerking, as if flesh had already fallen away. Drums echoed like heartbeats fading into silence, flutes carved from bones whispered hollow notes, and dancers clattered with shells and bells imitating the sound of skeletons in motion. This was the dance of the bones, the living liturgy of Ah Puch's banquet. The people did not fear as they danced, they honored. For by imitating the dead, they embraced their fate, showing reverence to the Lord of Silence. Children laughed, elders wept, and all remembered that they too would one day join the eternal dance in the halls of Xibalbá. Thus, the dance was both memento and offering, a ritual feast enacted by the living in shadow of the feast of the dead. Families gathered not only to mourn but to commune. On nights of remembrance, altars were raised with food, drinks, incense, and objects loved by the departed. These offerings were not for the living to consume, but for the dead. Their essence traveled to Xibalbá, feeding ancestors in the great banquet of Ah Puch. The living shared these meals in ritual. They ate what remained after the essence was consumed, believing they dined in communion with their ancestors. Each bite was sacred, each sip a bond across the boundary of death. In this way the Feast of Bones was not only for Ah Puch and his lords but for all the dead. Every ancestor sat at his table, every family joined in silence. The banquet united all generations, weaving past and present into one eternal meal. When blood spilled upon the battlefield, Ah Puch's banquet grew vast. The cries of the wounded, the silence of the fallen, the rivers of red flowing into soil, all were courses upon his eternal table. Owls circled above, bats swooped low, shadows lengthened. The lords of death gathered, their laughter echoing over corpses. Warriors who died with honor believed their essence went swiftly into Xibalbá, carried proudly before the throne of Ah Puch. Their bones became trophies, not of cruelty but of reverence, reminders that even courage ended in silence. War was thus another form of sacrifice, another ritual feast. Every battle was a banquet, every fallen warrior a guest delivered to the halls below. Victory or defeat mattered little, for in death, all returned to the same table, the same throne, the same eternal feast of bones. Though terrible, the feast of bones was also wisdom. It reminded mortals that their bodies were temporary, that their possessions crumbled, that their voices faded. In this truth lay humility. For no man, no king, no dynasty could escape the banquet. The Maya did not resist this wisdom. They embraced it in their rituals, their dances, their offerings. To live in denial was folly, to live in acknowledgement was sacred. By accepting their place in the feast, they found strength, meaning, and balance. The feast was not an end, but a lesson, that life is fragile, and in its fragility lies its beauty. Even after temples fell silent and jungles swallowed cities, the Feast of Bones endured in memory. Travelers who found skulls in caves, bones in cenotes, ruins of Tsimpantli walls, still felt the presence of Ah Puch. His banquet was not forgotten, for bones do not lie. In the silence of the Yucatan nights, when owls cry and cenotes breathe mist into the air, the feast is remembered. Modern ears may not know the words, modern tongues may not name Ah Puch, but their hearts still tremble before the banquet. For death remains, and with it, the eternal meal of silence. The feast is not past. It is present. It is eternal. Thus was the Feast of Bones, the eternal banquet of Ah Puch. From funerals to cenotes, from sacrifices to wars, from the tables of the living to the halls of the dead, all life became his offering. Flesh transformed into soil, blood into rivers, bones into relics. Time itself was devoured, every heartbeat a morsel consumed in silence. The Maya did not resist this truth. They embraced it, honoring the feast with rituals and dances, with offerings and prayers, with remembrance and humility. For they knew that to live was to be part of the banquet, that to breathe was already to be seated at the eternal table. And at the head of that table sat Ah Puch, sovereign of silence, master of decay, devourer of time. His bells rang softly, his skull grinned eternally, his throne stood unshaken. For as long as life endured, the Feast of Bones would continue. And when life ceased, the feast would remain. Ah Puch does not vanish. His throne of bones is not bound to one age, nor confined to the caves of the Yucatan. His sovereignty is eternal, stretching across centuries, across the collapse of kingdoms, across the silence of ruins reclaimed by the jungle. When the temples fell and the plazas grew quiet, when vines swallowed stones and jaguars roamed freely through forgotten cities, Ah Puch did not depart. He remained seated, unmoving, unblinking, his skull face watching the procession of time itself. The voices of priests fell silent, the chants of dancers faded, yet his bells still rang in every death, his owls still cried in every night. His throne is the earth itself, his court the silence between heartbeats, his kingdom the unending march of mortality. The fall of empires is his feast, the erosion of mountains his hymn, the fading of stars his coronation. Thus, Ah Puch is eternal not because he conquers but because he waits. Though men no longer gather in plazas to chant his name, the storm of memory carries him still. In the cry of the owl, in the shadow of the cenote, in the silence before a storm, his presence is felt. Farmers who bury their dead whisper prayers they no longer name. Travelers who hear wings at night shiver with unease they cannot explain. Children who dream of skulls wake in terror of a truth older than words. The jungle remembers him. Its ruins whisper his presence. Its cenotes breathe his silence. The very wind through the ceiba trees carries the echo of his bells. Time has not erased him, for time itself belongs to him. And so, even without temples, even without priests, even without carved glyphs, Ah Puch endures, in memory, in fear, in silence. Of all his powers, none is greater than silence. Silence is his true form, his eternal hymn, his throne and his crown. For silence is not absence, but presence. The presence of endings, the fullness of eternity. The Maya knew this truth. When drums ceased, when chants ended, when fires died, silence remained. That silence was Ah Puch. It was the God that cannot be erased, for it is the God that remains when all else is consumed. Even now silence rules. In the stillness of graves, in the hush of the jungle at midnight, in the pause between breaths, Ah Puch is enthroned. He is not forgotten because he cannot be forgotten. He is woven into the silence that all must enter, into the silence that all must know. Though his throne lies in Xibalbá, his shadow stretches into the world of the living. He walks beside every man, unseen yet certain, his bells ringing softly with each heartbeat. At birth he watches. At marriage he waits. At harvest he counts. At death he claims. No prayer can banish him, no ritual delay him. He is not enemy but companion, the shadow that proves the existence of light. His presence gives weight to joy, meaning to song, urgency to love. Without his shadow, life would lose its brilliance. Thus, though feared, he is also necessary. He is the silent witness to every breath, the uninvited guest at every feast, the unseen figure at every fire. His shadow is always present, stretching longer as the sun descends, until all are gathered into his embrace. The Maya said that the voice of Ah Puch was not only the owl's cry, but also the storm. Thunder was his laughter rolling across the sky, lightning his hacha of bones striking the earth, rain his tears falling into cenotes and rivers. Storms were moments when his presence was undeniable, when heaven and earth trembled beneath his power. In the storm the people heard both destruction and renewal. Crops were beaten down yet nourished by rain. Rivers flooded yet carried life. Trees fell yet fed the soil. The storm was the banquet of the sky, and Ah Puch presided over it as sovereign. Even today, when thunder shakes the heavens, his presence is remembered. For the storm is eternal as death, as eternal as silence. Beneath the earth, the procession of souls continues. From the first man to the last unborn, all march toward the throne of Ah Puch. The line never ends, never falters, never pauses. Each step echoes in caverns without light, each breath fades into silence, each soul becomes part of the banquet. The procession is eternal. It marches when men plant maize, when children laugh, when cities rise, when empires fall. It marches when stars shine and when they fade. It marches when no one remembers the names of kings, when no one speaks the language of ancestors. For the procession belongs not to time, but to eternity. And at its end waits Ah Puch, silent, patient, sovereign. Thus ends the legend of Ah Puch, the Lord of Xibalbá, the skull-faced sovereign of silence. His throne is eternal, his banquet unending, his shadow unbroken. He is the truth beneath every mask, the silence beneath every song, the end that gives meaning to beginnings. The Maya did not curse him. They honored him. For they knew that without him, life would have no rhythm, no urgency, no beauty. His silence was not cruelty but covenant. His feast was not destruction but balance. His presence was not fear alone but truth. And so, though centuries have passed and cities have fallen, though jungles have swallowed temples and languages have changed, Ah Puch remains. His owls cry in the night. His storms roll across the heavens. His silence lingers in every breath. For death is eternal. Silence is eternal. And Ah Puch, sovereign of both, will reign forever. Silence falls. The story of Ah Puch, Lord of Xibalbá, sovereign of skulls, devourer of time, comes to its eternal end, yet this end is no ending at all. For his throne is still seated in the marrow of the earth, his owls still circle the night, his storms still roll across the heavens. He remains. Every heartbeat is his bell ringing softly. Every breath is a grain of maize consumed in his feast. Every shadow is his cloak stretched over the living. The Maya knew this truth, and so do we, though we speak his name less often. Death is eternal, silence is eternal, and Ah Puch reigns where all else falls away. When the temples crumble and the jungles reclaim stone, when languages fade and memories dissolve, when even stars burn out in the darkness, his throne will remain. His procession of souls will march unbroken. His banquet of bones will never empty. His silence will stretch beyond the end of time. For Ah Puch is not forgotten. He cannot be forgotten. He is the shadow in all men, the final truth, the last word that needs no voice. And so, remember, when the owl cries in the night, when thunder shakes the heavens, when silence lingers after song, listen. It is Ah Puch. It is the eternal storm. It is the covenant of death. He is not gone. He is not distant. He is here. Forever.